We're going to finish up our discussion on the endocrine physiology by taking a look at thyroid hormones. As you know from the experiment that you were supposed to do with the lab rats, there was this lab experiment from last week. Thyroid hormone is a general stimulator of metabolism. Now, metabolism is a big word. It's the sum total of all the reactions. And it is true that thyroid hormone actually affects pretty much all your cells. There are many thyroid response elements in your DNA and the genes of your in your nucleus, and it drives basically all your metabolic functions. In the development of children, so basically in fetal development and embryonic fetal development, it's essential that you have thyroid hormone for normal development of your nervous system, especially. So it's very important to check thyroid levels during pregnancy, because it can be very bad for children during pregnancy when the mother doesn't have enough thyroid hormone. Anyway, thyroid hormone, while it doesn't look like a steroid hormone, it actually acts like as a steroid hormone. So it has to be transported in the plasma with a globulin bound to a binding globulin. So it's called the TBG, the thyroid binding globulin. And then the target cells, they will convert the T4 to T3, which is the active form of the hormone, and then that acts in the nucleus by binding to a nuclear receptor and then binding to DNA, becoming a transcription factor that then regulates the transcriptional activity of many genes. So here is your thyroid gland, an anatomy picture. It's like this butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. And here, taking a look inside, you may have seen that in anatomy when you did histology. These thyroid follicles that are throughout the thyroid gland, and in these follicles, in these follicular fluid right there, that's where the manufacture of the actual hormone takes place. So we'll take a look at the chemistry here of the hormone, and the tyrosine, that's the amino acid that functions sort of as the model molecule here. And then basically we take one tyrosine and then have the ring structure from another tyrosine and add these two together, and we'll attach 4 iodines here, 1, 2, 3, 4, for the tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. And then here we have 3 iodines, 1, 2, 3 iodines, and that's triiodothyronine. That's the active version of the hormone. This is what the thyroid gland manufactures for the most part, and this is the T3 here is the active, biologically active form. But this here is what's mostly being manufactured in the thyroid gland. So here we sort of this pathway. We don't need much detail on this, but here it shows that you do need iodine in the blood, so that it's essential. If you don't have iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone. That's a fact. So here the biochemical pathway again. So for tetraiodo and triiodothyronine, you can take a look at that. And then what's being released into the blood, it's mostly T4, and then it will bind to a binding globulin and get transported in the blood. The reason for the binding protein is because by adding these 2 ring structures, the molecule becomes is no longer water soluble, and so it needs a binding protein to mask the lipid properties of the hormone. On the other hand, it makes it easier to get into the cells because it can just cross the phospholipid bilayer. It does not need a cell surface receptor. So here, one more time, my favorite hormone axis right here. So this one, from the hypothalamus, we need the TRH, that's the thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that acts on the anterior pituitary to make the thyroid stimulating hormone, and the TSH then acts on the actual gland, the thyroid gland, to make T3 and T4, and then we get this general increase of metabolism. So systemic metabolic effects, a lot of them. Here is the profile sheet of the thyroid hormones. You can take a look. One thing I'm always finding interesting is the half-life is pretty long with the thyroid hormones. So 6 to 7 days is like a week. That's a lot. That's really long-term kind of effects. And the target tissue, yeah, everywhere. Everything, everywhere. And the target receptor, keep in mind, it is a hormone that acts just like the steroid hormones, even though doesn't have that steroid structure, but it will go into the nucleus, bind to a nuclear receptor, and then together they become transcription factors that affect the transcriptional activity of many genes. Okay, so thyroid pathologies and the effect they have on the quality of life. So you can either have too much thyroid hormone or not enough thyroid hormone. Either way is bad. It used to be a common thing that people had goiters, and if you remember that one of the first slides in this lecture was this artifact, this ancient artifact of this person apparently with a goiter in their neck. So goiters throughout human history have been a very common pathology, and they result from too much TSH stimulating the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is growing and causing this hypertrophy that you can then see as a bulging out on the neck, and it's called a goiter. So hyperthyroidism, a lot of times a goiter is associated with hyperthyroidism. There's something called Graves' disease, and we had that in the lab when you were doing the lab experiment last week, or this theoretical lab experiment, I guess. So the thyroid stimulating, we have these immunoglobulins that act like TSH. So they mimic TSH, they bind to the same receptor, and in Graves' disease, it's an autoimmune disease where you're making antibodies that look like and act like TSH. And because you have so many of them, of these antibodies, they constantly stimulate the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormone, just like normally the TSH would do. And so what you end up having in Graves' disease is a person with a goiter, because all of this TSH stimulation, or it's a lookalike TSH. And then you have tons of thyroid hormone that are flooding your system. So you have all the effects of hyperthyroidism, which is an increase in metabolism, higher heart rate, higher metabolism, and in association. So if you wanted to see if somebody has Graves' disease, what you could do is you could see how much of the hormone is present, and how much, whether or not this person has TSH-like antibodies, and then, what might you expect? How about your real TSH levels from the pituitary? Well, they should be low, because we're sending negative feedback all the time. Hey, we're having too much or plenty of thyroid hormone, so we don't need any TSH. So in Graves' disease, you would have low TSH levels, but you would find these TSH-like antibodies, and you would have tons of thyroid hormone in circulation. If you have a pituitary tumor that's secreting TSH, well, then the level, of course, you're going to have a lot of TSH. You're going to also have a goiter, and you're going to have a ton of thyroid hormone. And both TSH and the thyroid hormone will be high, and this person definitely has hyperthyroidism with all of the effects of it. Hypothyroidism is when you don't have enough thyroid hormone. It's relatively easy to fix because we have Synthroid. It's a synthetic thyroid hormone, and you could give somebody that externally, so that's easy to fix, but you need to diagnose it. And sometimes the reason for hypothyroidism is the absence of negative feedback. That it should increase the TSH, and it doesn't work, and then you don't have enough TSH, and therefore you don't make enough thyroid hormone. So here is a person definitely with a goiter. The first thing I usually would suspect when I see somebody with a goiter is check the iodine levels, because if the gland can't make the hormone because there's not enough iodine around, then, well, of course, the pituitary and the hypothalamus are going crazy trying to instruct the gland to make more thyroid hormone, but it can't because there's not enough iodine. And so then the TSH levels will be ultra high, and they will cause then this hypertrophy of the gland, and the poor gland is trying to do what the pituitary says, but it can't. and then we end up with this goiter that is just a grossly enlarged thyroid gland. So here, more thyroid pathologies. So in hyperthyroidism, again, the gland secretes too much thyroid hormone, and then the measurable effects would be increased oxygen consumption. That was the parameter that you were supposed to measure on these rats that had the different thyroid issues. You're also going to produce a lot of metabolic heat because you have a general increase of metabolism. You can eat 3 plates of dinner and not gain any weight. Sounds great, actually. And people have used thyroid hormone as a way of losing weight, which it does work, but there are some bad side effects because we have influence on the beta adrenergic receptors in the heart. It can lead to arrhythmias, and also it can change the fiber composition in your heart, which is supposed to be an endurance muscle, and if you're changing it more to the fast glycolytic fibers, that can be a real problem that could lead to bad cardiorhythmias. So you also might end up with increased protein catabolism that could cause muscle weakness. And then a lot of people with thyroid pathologies, they have psychological problems, disturbances. And you might also have hyperexcitable reflexes. That would be another sign of hyperthyroidism. So in hyperthyroidism here, due to Graves' disease, again, we're going to have these thyroid stimulating antibodies. So basically we have TSH-like antibodies, that's what I like to call them. They constantly act on the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland enlarges, and plus we're making tons of T3 and T4. You have strong negative feedback onto the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Of course, you're going to have virtually zero TRH and virtually no TSH because all of this negative feedback to pituitary and hypothalamus, and you are bombarding your poor gland with these antibodies that look and act like TSH, and so the thyroid gland enlarges and you have hyperthyroidism due to way too much T3 and T4. One of the biggest signs here for hyperthyroidism is these bulging eyes. It's called exophthalmos. That means you have sort of these excessive deposits of mucopolysaccharides behind the eyes, and they are pushing out the eyeballs basically, and then you have sort of these what looks like bulging eyes. Oh, look at these guys. Ooh. This guy clearly here, the big old goiter and then the bulging eyes. These guys, they look a little scary, but anyway, so this is typical for Graves' disease, this exophthalmos, these bulging eyes due to these deposits of mucopolysaccharides behind the eyes. Okay. Now hypothyroidism has the opposite effect. So you're going to have an extra slow metabolism. You feel cold a lot of times. You look at food, you already gained 10 pounds, that kind of stuff. And so very slow metabolism, always tired, depressed, low oxygen consumption, decreased protein synthesis. You might end up with mixed edema, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. A big thing is during pregnancy, hypothyroidism is really bad for the developing fetus, and it can cause something called cretinism. That means that the nervous system did not develop properly, and so it leads to severe neurological problems in the baby. And in another effect of hypothyroidism is bradycardia, which is a heartbeat that's abnormally slow heart rate. Here's somebody with the mixed edema. There you would have this person, the baggy eyes. Basically, you can see sort of this these deposits beneath the skin. Mixed edema. And here somebody has this would be in the legs, the mixed edema that sort of blocks the movement of fluids, and you have this real swelling that occurs here in the legs in this case. Okay, and that's it for the endocrine section.